Hello, everybody, and I hope that you're doing well. We are rapidly approaching the end of the term with 3 full weeks left before we get to the end of the spring quarter. So I want to just give you an update about what to expect as we get to the end here. So this week, we're looking at health and science campaigns. In addition to Dupree and the Alcalay piece, we have a quiz and Canvas prompt. In the last 2 weeks, we'll talk about gender and health and science communication and health, science, and disability. After that, the Health and Science Campaign essay is due on June 15th. You can think about this as your final major assignment in the course. There's no cumulative final exam, but instead this is your last major assignment. And there's also an extra credit opportunity where you can take things a step further and actually develop your own health and science campaign, such as creating a poster or advertisement that you would submit as a part of this assignment. The extra credit is optional, but definitely something that you can do if you're interested. And then just as a last reminder, all final assignments for the term need to be turned in by June 15th. That's the hard deadline for the course, just with the end of the term and academic year. So do keep that in mind as you're working through the remaining assignments. I've enjoyed looking through your work so far on your health and science disparities essay. I'm still working through that assignment, but I should have your grades and feedback up on that assignment by the end of this week. So thank you for your hard work through that. And I look forward to seeing the work that you're putting together for the last few weeks of the term. So this week, we're going to talk a little bit about the Health and Science Campaign essay. In particular, this week's material discussing health and science campaigns, the process of developing a successful campaign, and the ways of thinking about campaigns effectively are all related to this topic. And we'll talk about how some of the ways of conveying health information occur through these campaigns as well. So the Health and Science Campaign essay is due on June 15th. And what I'm going to be asking you to do is to select a major health or science-related campaign, introducing the campaign, describing its audience, and explaining how it communicates about health and science information to that audience. Once you've explained what it's doing, part two is to explain the communication involved in this campaign. How does it message, circulate, or share its information? So this should explain how this campaign is communicating to its audience. And lastly, I'm asking you to consider the effectiveness of this communication. Does it reach its audience well? Does it make a persuasive argument? Or is it perhaps off base in the arguments that it makes relative to the people that it's trying to reach? For example, a good example of a health and science campaign would be something like DARE, which is designed to raise awareness about drug use and violence for children. So your essay should use at least 3 outside scholarly sources. Again, these could be drawing from the things you've developed in your annotated bibliography. They should provide additional context into health campaigns, a health campaign that you might be selecting and using here that can look into some of the details. For instance, you might also look at a campaign such as National Breast Cancer Awareness Month. So I encourage you to take some time, think about the campaigns that interest you and topics that interest you within this course to select a project for this assignment. I'm happy to look over rough drafts, outlines, or answer questions as you're preparing for this one too. So let's go ahead and get into it. Talking a little bit about health and science related campaigns, how they matter, and some of the fundamentals of what they do. Right? First of all, it's important to recognize that lives are on the line when it comes to health and science-related campaigns, that an effectively run health campaign can save lives. It can be preventative. It can help develop the strategy for being aware about how to address issues, for example, in the context of HIV/AIDS, providing awareness, training, resources, and information about this process in navigating HIV/AIDS can be really useful and save lives and support the lives of people who are HIV positive. So the process of sharing this information has significant implications for health and policy. Health campaigns, right, they can address health disparities, populations that are particularly impacted. For example, the messaging and circulation of an advertisement or campaign might target a particular race or demographic that is not able to be in the loop as much. For example, the local nonprofit Oregon Rural Action actually developed a radio show in Spanish to speak to agricultural workers surrounding COVID-19. So it's also important to consider issues of mis and disinformation and gaps that some of the populations might experience regarding health and science information. And as we know, health and science campaigns can use new technology. We're seeing more recent campaigns that have taken to using things such as TikTok and other forms of social media to discuss and reach a younger generation. You might be familiar, if you're older, with campaigns such as DARE about drugs and violence, but a lot more recent campaigns are taking on the use of media, whether it's through the use of an interactive game or utilizing social media content to engage with their audiences. So I think one of the important guiding questions here is, if the purpose of a health campaign is to save lives, is to encourage healthy behavior, is to educate the public and change their motivations, when does it work and when doesn't it work? That's especially important if you're interested in a career in public health communication, and making a broader public aware of health and science related issues. So there's a few ways that we can break this down. So health campaigns are effective when they understand what the values, beliefs, and resources of the audience are. For instance, if we think about it this way, values are in many ways at the core of people's identities. They refer to things such as religious and spiritual views, strong convictions and beliefs that are incredibly important. For instance, you value honesty. A belief is what you know to be true, oftentimes based on the values. For instance, believing that everything happens for a reason. And then attitudes is how you think or feel about something that's a lot more malleable and able to change. You could have a positive attitude about exercise, but you believe that it's difficult to integrate exercise into your life. So a health campaign needs to understand the values and beliefs of audiences, especially recognizing that core values are very difficult to change. For instance, a campaign could reach people who want to be healthy and who see healthy behavior as a good thing, but are not sure how to integrate that into their day-to-day lives. It's also important to consider available resources. For instance, if you are trying to encourage healthy eating and healthy behavior, perhaps the foods that you're advertising or trying to get people to use cost a lot of time and cost a lot of money to prepare and utilize. And that can be a big barrier in reaching health communication properly with populations. So think about what the person has at their disposal that enables healthy behavior, what that person believes, and how you can support those beliefs. For example, teenagers are more likely to engage in reckless behavior and not see their long-term health as important. An illusion of invulnerability or just having a pessimism about the future might be a reason that they're less likely to pursue healthy behaviors. So it's important to address and engage with that mindset and attitude of teenagers when developing a health campaign targeted for them. So this also brings us to a health promotion campaign. These are what's considered to be systematic efforts to influence people in health-enhancing behaviors. In other words, persuading and trying to get people on board in what it means to be healthy and how to engage in a healthy way. Distributing and creating messages that are designed to be healthy and to reach people in that way effectively. So a health promotion campaign, we can think again about an example such as Heart Association discouraging people from drinking sugary sweets, avoiding overly sugary beverages. So a health promotion campaign can effectively start by defining the situation and its benefits. You might be at a greater risk of heart disease as a result of drinking very sugary beverages, but you would benefit from a longer life and better quality of life if you switch out of drinking that drink. Figuring out and analyzing the part of the audience who is able to be persuaded. You think about COVID-19, there were a lot of major social and political divisions, and people who were not going to be convinced one way or another about vaccination or masking. The people who are on the fence or able to be convinced with proper information are people who can be effectively segmented in the target audience. Figuring out goals and objectives. What is it that this health promotion campaign seeks to do? Is it seeking to get people vaccinated? Is it seeking to reduce the cases of type 2 diabetes in the United States? And then lastly, how is this campaign communicating? So how is it using a variety of forms, whether it's public communication, social media, marketing, how is it reaching its audience and reaching so in a way that's effective to that audience that they've targeted? For example, maybe it's picking particular stations or so forms of social media that can reach that audience effectively. Another important thing to consider here is motivation, including the motivation of people who are on the receiving end of a particular health campaign. First of all, it's a good idea to establish, what is considered to be a successful campaign. What makes the campaign work? In other words, if you see the rates of type 2 diabetes go down in the United States, that might be an indicator of the campaign being successful. We have to consider what the situation is and what possible benefits somebody has for changing their behavior. Again, one factor to consider is the short-term versus long-term benefit. And sometimes people might be more motivated by short-term gains. We also have to understand that people have a lot of different motivations. Sometimes people are interested in healthy behavior, but they find that exercise is very difficult to incorporate into their lives because they have limited time and energy, and they're oftentimes exhausted. And again, instead of taking a very broad audience, narrow casting and finding a specific audience within that broader group that you aim to persuade and convince about something is especially important here. Another thing to consider is when doing formal research study, if you've taken a class with me, such as research methods, you know that this has to go through the IRB, or Institutional Review Board, who evaluates ethical studying and research. Just keep that in mind as you're considering some of the ways in which these campaigns reach a public audience. Another way that health promotion happens through campaigns and concentrated efforts is through the use of questionnaires, right? Asking participants questions and motivating engagement in order to understand the attitudes, beliefs, and values of the audience. So asking questions, for example, about teenagers and their drug behavior might be a way of engaging. First of all, keeping the questionnaire brief, seeking an immediate response where you ask a question and immediately they're addressing that. Using demographic information, including changing up some of the ways in which you present that information to reduce bias, can be useful. Asking about people's knowledge and behavior using a variety of open and closed-ended questions. For example, closed-ended question it might be, how often do you exercise a week? More open-ended question would be, tell me about the ways that you exercise. A pilot would be doing an initial questionnaire to test that questionnaire to somebody before you reach the broader public, and allowing people to be anonymous, especially if they're concerned with how their data and information is being used, is also really important. So in addition to this, and reaching and developing a health campaign through one-on-one questionnaires, another way that health campaigns develop and can be used to create an effective message is through the use of focus grouping and sampling. So focus groups involve a small collection of people, oftentimes 8 to 10, who work together and are being asked to address a number of topics, concerns, or issues. By working together, members of the focus group bounce off ideas, they share questions, they seek input and response. And by doing that, they have the opportunity to bounce off ideas with one another and develop a discussion. For example, maybe they're presented with a health campaign and they talk about what they see as effective or ineffective about that campaign. And then sampling is involving looking at a set of people to understand their health behaviors or actions, right? When you do research, particularly quantitative research, you're not going to survey everybody. You're going to pick a representation of that broader population that you choose to reach out to. One idea that we've talked about a little bit in this class is the ways in which there are issues in terms of accessing technology, resources, and information, and the way that that can influence campaigns. And that ties pretty closely to what's known as the knowledge gap hypothesis. As you can see from this graph here on the right, the idea is that people who have less education and understanding of media are going to get information at a slower rate than people who have better education and access to technological resources. That is, if you have access to internet connections, you have access to social media, you are more likely to seek out information about health and use that information in your own lives. Which again contributes to this idea of the digital divide and how individuals, particularly across social and economic and age-related lines might not have the same access to media campaigns and healthy behavior that younger and more educated generations might. Right, we think about the idea of social capital, right? Dr. Anthony Fauci with the United States' response to COVID-19 gained a lot of attention, right? Whether you love him or hate him, right? He kind of exemplifies the idea of social capital and how personal credibility or background can play a key role in public science and health information reaching its audience. The idea that the benefits of health can be best realized when people in the community build connections and trust. Again, if we think back to Tuskegee syphilis and the implications of that, there's a lot of significant distrust that people might have of the healthcare system or of scientists or people who work in the health field. And so it's important to build a meaningful connection that allows individuals to trust figures that are providing and communicating information about health to the audience. So a lot of health campaigns succeed when they are focusing on the audience and the values, beliefs, and interests of the audience, which might involve segmenting, finding specific populations and groups that share similarities to the campaign that you aim to reach. And if you imagine, right, this health campaign, maybe it's about breast cancer awareness, encouraging people to seek a mammogram. Perhaps it's thinking about this as a single person. Who is your target person? What are they like? Maybe you're imagining a woman in her early 30s to late 40s who is, considers herself healthy but might be at risk. And you encourage her to have the chance to get tested. One example of the challenges, as mentioned, in health campaigns and reaching an audience is to think about teenagers. Oftentimes, teenagers are going through a major developmental phase where they feel that other people, like adults, don't understand or get their experiences and the challenges that they're working through. Of course, the challenges of COVID-19 and quarantine have intensified the way that teenagers often feel that their experiences are specific and not understood by other generations. Oftentimes, teenagers are worried about the imaginary audience, their peers, other people, people who might be involved in social media, who are looking at them and evaluating what they do. We also know that teenagers, adolescents tend to seek higher levels of arousal. They like things to be interesting and they're seeking, kind of thrills, pleasure, and so on. You're familiar with the phrase YOLO, you only live once. That was popular with a lot of teenagers who were interested in kind of taking risks and thrills at that stage of life. Also, another idea here is the idea of psychological reticence, that for a lot of teenagers, they don't want to be told what to do. Having control over their own lives is really important here. And then lastly, there's what's known as the activation model for information exposure, which says that when there's an optimal level of arousal, engages well enough with the reader or the viewer of the message, that's going to encourage good behavior. One good example of this, right, is seeing this advertisement. Don't be a loser, don't drink and drive. It's using that kind of language to engage with the teenage audience. It's kind of provocative. It's suggesting that, underage drinking under the influence is going to be something that makes you a loser, appealing to the kind of social constraints and concerns that teenagers might have to try to make this campaign effective and resonant with the audience. So when we think about developing a campaign, right, it's about thinking about the goals and objectives. What do we hope to do and how do we hope to do it? It's about being accountable, right? How much money are you investing into this campaign and what's going to actually happen? Oftentimes in an effort to cut costs and save money, it's really important to explain what makes this campaign work and to be able to measure its success in actionable ways. Sometimes saying, oh, we're spreading awareness, we're making people in the know about this thing, is not really very tangible or easy to be able to trace. There's also what's known as a disease map. This was used a lot in COVID-19 to indicate regions and areas in the country or the world in which there were greater likelihood of people having disease or having greater risk, which can also motivate a lot of health campaigns. So if we think about reaching communication, we can think about the different channels, right, or means of communicating this information. When we think about communicating through this, we can consider the number of people that are exposed to a message, the reach. How many people are you reaching out to? Are you broadcasting internationally? Are you circulating to everybody in the world through social media? And specificity is how accurate the message can be targeted to a group. This is where things such as algorithms, right, targeting advertisements based on demographic information and details and activity become especially interesting. Things like Google Ads might ask you, is this advertisement relevant to you, in an effort to try to understand your background. An impact is how influential the group can be. How much can we reach or impact this group? For example, LGBTQ+ teenagers, and making them aware of PrEP and preventative efforts against HIV/AIDS. Arousal is how exciting a message is. Sometimes the use of humor, of shock, of interest is designed to get our attention. And involvement is the amount of work that we have to do to understand the message. Oftentimes we're drawn to very visual and engaging multimedia forms, rather than having to read through a long text poster or PSA. So oftentimes having a simple, memorable, fun advertisement can be a way to communicate effectively, as seen here with a campaign encouraging safety for children. So other ways of thinking about media include the elaboration likelihood model that suggests that when we are really involved with a message, we're really thinking about and evaluating that message. In other words, we have to be hooked into a message in order to effectively engage and understand the key points of that message. As mentioned, you might take a broader health campaign in terms of who you represent in the advertisement, who you're trying to reach, where you air the ad. You might tailor the communication of that advertisement to the specific consumers and people who might be likely to be convinced or impacted by that message. There's also what's known as diffusions of innovations theory. That's suggesting that when there is new information that people receive as a part of a community or group, that information is filtered out and passed down through the members of that community or group over time. And then there's the idea of the two-step flow, where information is going from media to individuals and then circulating through people, right? So it's not what's considered to be an inoculation theory, where somebody is just injected with media, right? It's passing through a community. So sometimes a health campaign has to reach and engage with that community and their values and beliefs effectively in order to be useful. It's also useful to think about how campaigns are reaching audiences through the use of marketing, such as social marketing, like using commercials and advertisements to reach the audience effectively. And the idea here, right, is that the price of healthy behavior is worth paying for somebody to engage in exercise, doctor's appointments, and other things that might otherwise be seen as a cost to them. This also closely connects to what's known as the health belief model. And the health belief model suggests the following. If we don't change our behavior, we're going to face the consequences. If somebody is on the verge of being diabetic, like pre-diabetes, they might be encouraged to drastically change their behavior. Considerable effects, right? Being diabetic can have a variety of health consequences and challenges. Behavior change is preventing something that we might want to see happen. So perhaps it is your consumption of sugary beverages that is impacting your greater risk of being diabetic. And that the effect and cost of preventative behavior, such as choosing other beverages to drink and lowering your sugar intake, is a worthwhile thing to do. We're also motivated, we're moved by novel currents based on perception of susceptibility, right? So if we see, in particular, if we see a close family member, like a sibling who has an early stage of cancer, right? We're much more willing and likely to get tested for cancer ourselves. My father passed away from cancer. My sister just survived breast cancer. And so I'm a lot more anxious about cancer too. Cues to action. Something that motivates us to act. If there's an opening for us to see a doctor or health professional, and perhaps there are other signals and indicators that we might be at a particular risk of a condition. You might be familiar with Bandura and the Bobo dolls. The idea here was that when children saw other kids like beating up these inflatable dolls, that they were motivated to do that too. In other words, we're making decisions according to social cognitive theory based on factors like our emotions and environmental factors. What are other people doing? That's why things such as smoking, and alcohol consumption in minors are especially difficult, because it's seeing peers act in that way and encouraging that behavior. Ideally, there is synchronization between the social and environmental factors. In other words, we're motivated by our environment, but we're also motivated by meaningful relationships that we cultivate and make our decisions about health with that in mind. If you're familiar, here on the right is the Marlboro Man, referring to the cigarette company, right? This was a famous figure who was well known and circulated by, the cigarette company. And this was in many ways a factor influencing and impacting how information about health and tobacco companies were relating to that information. So the embedded behavior model suggests that behaviors are enduring to the extent that they're a part of our lifestyle and self-image, and they're supported by factors, right? So by portraying smoking cigarettes as being, part of being a rugged Western person, this was portrayed in an ideal light and encouraged this kind of embedded behavior. Decisions on smoking and whether or not we smoke, there's a variety of factors here. Our social environment, our use of advertising, our perception of risk are all influencing how we might make decisions on that front. There's also what's known as the theory of reasoned action. In other words, we can think about this as a dog doing tricks, right? The dog is going to sit, the dog is going to shake because it expects that it's going to receive a treat for doing so. In this way, similarly, as humans, we believe that doing something will cause something to happen. For instance, we think regular exercise will help with losing weight. So if we see there are positive outcomes and implications for doing something, we're more likely to incorporate that. We see it as tangible as a result of our behavior. Theory of reasoned action, right, is suggesting how people behave. When they see something in it and benefiting them overall, they're more likely to take on a healthy behavior. This is part of what made the discourse related to COVID-19 difficult. If somebody does not perceive wearing a mask or being vaccinated as a positive social good, that can make it more difficult to persuade that audience. There's also what's known as the theory of planned behavior. In other words, one of the challenges, particularly in health communication and healthy outcomes, is that you can go into a doctor's office, they can tell you, you need to do X, Y, Z, and while you want to do it, maybe you don't end up acting on what your doctor asked you to do. We have intentions about issues. We consider that they're rewarding and acceptable, and we might have limits in our ability to carry it out. We know that we should be exercising more and getting out more every day, but in actuality, we don't end up doing the level of exercise we were asked to do. Or procrastination. We don't intend to procrastinate. We intend to pace ourselves in working through an assignment, but we become busy, we become distracted with other things, and then we don't end up sitting down and really doing it. There's also what's known as the trans-theoretical model, which explains the process of decision-making and behavior. What this model suggests is that humans are not going to receive information and make a decision. Instead, we're going to go through a few different phases to adopt this behavior too. For instance, we start with pre-contemplation, thinking about and addressing how we might deal with an issue. Contemplation is taking time to think about and to address a particular topic or problem, understanding it cognitively. Preparing is taking a plan, figuring out what you're going to do, taking action to address the problem, and then maintaining it over a longer period. We think about dieting and weight loss. One of the problems with a lot of fad diets or styles is that they don't necessarily allow for long-term maintenance and healthy eating, which encourages people to kind of slide back into previous habits and regain weight that they've lost. All this to say, right, our ability to change our behaviors about health take a lot of different steps. For instance, if you're encouraged to exercise more, you might start from not knowing you needed to do that. You're understanding the importance and need to exercise. You're developing perhaps a schedule. Maybe you sign up for a gym. You go to the gym regularly, and you keep yourself engaged and healthy over time. There's also what's known as the critical and cultural approach. So a good example of this, and we'll talk more about this when we discuss disability, but is deaf populations and cochlear implants. So Cochlear implants allow many people who are deaf to be able to pick up on audio and hear. And while many people embrace cochlear implants, there are members of the deaf community who tie their identity of deafness as really crucial and important, and feel that cochlear implants run the risk of destroying the particular culture and identity that comes with being deaf. What this suggests is that culture, power control, and identity are important when we're thinking about health. What we consider to be the best or the healthy way to behave, well, it's a product of culture. And so what's considered to be healthy for one person might mean something very different for somebody else. There's also this idea of collective efficacy, that belief in change. We believe that actions can have consequences and positively influence our communication. And community capacity is the resources that we have available to promote the kind of behavior that we want. Can our community group of people be able to receive this positive health outcome? Can we receive the support from a doctor or practitioner if we need it? So it's important to think about, especially as you look at these health and science campaigns for this class, to think about the ways in which culture is being factored into what these campaigns are doing. Thinking about the sources and the quality of the sources. Oftentimes people believe sources similar to them, such as spokespeople who come from similar backgrounds, like somebody who graduated from the same place that you did, who's coming back as a guest speaker. The idea of a gain frame appeal is, look at all these great things that happen if you quit smoking. It's easier for you to breathe and get outside. And a loss frame appeal is the idea that not doing something is going to have negative actions. If you don't get tested, you might have a diagnosis that's much harder to grapple with. A logical appeal suggests that if you do X, Y will happen, right? If you think about, for instance, Aristotle's syllogism, X leads to Y. And an emotional appeal says what somebody should believe to motivate their values and behavior, right? What is, appealing to our emotions and feelings, what feels right and good to us is important. There's the extended parallel process that suggests that we evaluate a threatening message due to factors such as the possible risk that could have. How much of a risk do we have of this condition or problem? And we also know that we are motivated very strongly by the use of guilt, particularly if we feel guilty for not following particular health advice we consider to be important. Sometimes that can lead to despair and not really changing our behavior, or that can be a powerful motivator to get back on the wagon. So the alkalase piece gets into some more details here and adds some further context into our discussion that examines what makes some mass health campaigns effective. And the piece goes into a number of different kinds of health campaigns. I think adds some useful context here that you can use as you're thinking about your own project. Some of the key findings of this piece is suggesting that mass communication is better at reinforcing rather than changing people's attitudes or beliefs. Again, identifying some of those beliefs and values can be difficult to change. And that a mass message, such as an advertisement, can be difficult because it doesn't mean that the audience themselves is engaging as much either. So we have to consider the social context and location of individuals that are receiving these messages and advertisements. Where are they receiving these messages from, and how does the reception of these messages change the way that they're communicating? So we've covered a lot of ground here in talking about health and science campaigns. I encourage you to think about, as you're preparing for your health and science campaign essay or possibly your extra credit, how you can utilize some of this information to analyze a campaign that's interesting to you. We've discussed a variety of theories to explain what motivates us for healthy behavior. We've talked about how a campaign can be effective and the ways in which it considers a variety of factors, including social and cultural ones, to motivate itself toward change. Next week, we're going to talk about issues of gender and gender's relationship to health and science communication. So look forward to that. Have a great rest of your week, and I look forward to continuing our discussion next week.